Welcome back to our podcast, which is Conversations in Conversational AI. Today we have Jordan, who's the founder of Vapi, and we're super excited to hear from Jordan on where Voices AI is at today and where it's going, how to think about different platforms, etc. Jordan, yeah, super stoked to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I was excited to hop on. I think there are no no, there's only two or three voice podcasts in existence, so I'm thrilled to be a part of one of the only ones.
Nice.
Yeah,
The
so thank
the
you for having me.
irony of that. I know that you've had a pretty crazy journey into voice AI. You famously, I think, pivoted into voice AI several years after you started the company.
Mm.
How have you seen the platform shift over the last year? Like, where do you think platforms were at last summer when voice AI was really just starting to take off and you guys were just starting to take off? And
Mm.
where do you think kind of voice platforms are at today and what's their role in the ecosystem?
Yeah, in the early days, so that would have been maybe August, September of 2023. I think that's when, platforms like us started to exist. It was like us and like two startups that were like tinkering with voice related stuff, many of which weren't even doing phone call related stuff for the most part. They were doing like sales role play training or like trying to think of I don't even know what the other like AI interviewing. Very random, like I think like at the time lower value than phone kind of use cases. So yeah, they were like kind of the innovators if you look at like the whole usual adoption curve. And then slowly I think other startups also doing kind of weird things started to pop up. We saw everything from like AI girlfriends to like this one company like doing inbound calls for Swiss ski lodges and just like it was all over the place. Like there was no order to it, but the one pattern was that they were all like pre-seed or like pre-funding kind of startups like before the models reached the point where they were human enough or fast enough to actually be feasible to use in the real world. It's like we existed and at the time our big focus was just like getting latency low. And at the time like we were one of the few to actually have it low enough where it was fit for real time conversation because it was really hard with all these external dependencies that were all independently quite slow to get them all down to the point where they were fast enough to run. And so that latency piece was really like our differentiator at the time and the reason that people would use us rather than like roll it themselves. Nobody was like operating at a significant enough scale that infrastructure or like reliability at scale was like a problem. Everybody was like a tiny ass company, so they didn't really care that much about reliability, or they had a really high tolerance for like when things went down. And so the defensibility was really just in speed and flexibility to like use different models because these are all extremely technical teams. We saw following that maybe every 3 months there would be a new model that came out across the stack, whether that's in transcription or LLMs or text to speech models. For example, a text to speech model might come out that's like 2x as like human performant or like half the latency. And every 3 months this would happen. We would go from like 1600 to 800 to 400. It was like the craziest thing. And so every time it happened, we just immediately more startups like started popping up that could take advantage of things that were closer to human performance. Mostly continued uh, until I think it was like March of 2024 when things actually really started to pick up. That's when we kind of reached an inflection point where venture funding started to like flood in to all these different startups, and these startups actually became like seed stage companies that were, actually unlocking value for real businesses, mostly over the phone. I'll pause there if there's any questions, but I'm happy to continue as well.
Yeah, no, this is super interesting because I think we are seeing like that's kind of when we started to see things happening. It was like April, like kind of late spring, early summer when people were really starting to play around with voice AI. And that was actually true of our batch where there were tons of voice AI applications that came in. And that's actually why we ended up landing in Coval is we started with more generalized evals for any multi-step processes with LLMs and realized that voice was this like really hard to test area, was like really taking off. People were having it like had these evaluation challenges, but also I think it was just interesting because so many of these models finally had the reasoning capability to actually hold a conversation for several minutes. I think that was the inflection point we saw in like July when 4.0 came out.
Yeah, that 4.0 announcement, I think when I look back at the metrics maybe like 2 weeks ago for another podcast thing, and it was really after that 4.0 announcement that the growth started. It didn't
Hmm.
cause like a spike in usage or anything like that, but what it did is it just like created this broad awareness that okay, voice is going to be like really important and lots of startups should be built on voice. Not only that, but a lot of like existing Series A to D companies started thinking about voice and started tinkering themselves. And we saw a lot of them building their own stacks internally at that time and choosing to go down that path, which they came to regret, and now they're back. But generally, it just kicked off like knowledge that it was a problem that was really hard, which was great for us. And so then growth just sort of exploded. Like the Cambrian explosion of voice AI startups kicked off, slash existing companies wanting to get into voice. And then I think in maybe October of last year is when enterprises, I guess, started to turn their heads and look at voice AI more seriously. Everything from them either building it themselves or trying to use the real-time API and that being like really hard to wrangle and then scale. And of course, what we found with these enterprises is like they don't just need like a thing that talks. They need it to like work reliably and they need it to like scale reliably. And so that became a core part of our strategy is just like being able to scale to like enterprise level expectation. And that's kind of what we've been very focused on since then. Now it's March 2025, like 6 months ago. And so now we do a lot of work both for the self-serve community and for like large enterprises, both for like customer support use cases, which we see like are quite popular, or for those similar to those like AI interviewer things we saw like way back when. We're now seeing this Cambrian explosion of interesting voice AI products in enterprise as well. Like I can't name by name, but just very interesting large companies that have billions in revenue who are making big bets in voice.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think there's definitely, it's really exciting because it's this new platform of what does, I think every company had a web application, every company eventually had a mobile application. And I think voice is really similar, where you're going to
Yes.
see every company starting to have some sort of experience where users expect a voice interface for that experience. It might not be everything in the same way that you would then go and try and look at really complicated dashboards on a mobile app, but there's definitely going to be an expectation that that's a big part of like definitely consumer startups and I think or consumer companies and a lot of other core experiences. I'm curious like how you're balancing the enterprise needs and kind of platform aspects with vertical solutions, which are much more like focused, say, on customer support or focus on these specific verticals, or going more the developer tools route. Like, how are you balancing that with serving self-serve?
Yeah, like the way that we think about it is we have this platform that's built for developers and engineering teams that has a ton of configuration. It exposes everything. It's super reliable. That platform has two customers, or maybe three customers. The first customer is the startups that are building cool stuff on us for like vertical applications. The second startup is the Vapi dashboard, or the second customer is the Vapi dashboard. The third customer is our forward deployed team that goes out and like
Mhm.
does deployments for like larger companies and we'll just like use our platform to build like the actual end solution for them. There's a lot of the time, the vertical solutions are actually just like better. Like for example, they don't just need like AI agents for healthcare. They need like a full like EHR platform that also has, like phone is a big part of it or like an ops platform. I think those are the opportunities for the verticalized companies. And I think that's where they should move anyways. Like they should become like the operating system for like X industry. I think that's where what makes most sense. It doesn't
With
make sense
voice
for
as
us
like a
to do that.
core voice
Yeah.
as like a core competency of theirs, but not necessarily the only part of their
Yeah, like
platform.
voice is their wedge to get in to begin with. Yeah.
And what about in terms of like those companies that are building on Vapi, but are, let's say you're building a vertical agent on Vapi, like how do you kind of see these venture-backed companies scaling on Vapi? Where do you, like, when do you think it makes sense for them to build things in-house, like use something like Pipecat or LiveKit to really have, or even like their own voice infrastructure versus using something like Vapi for that?
Yeah, I think early on it did make sense to build it yourself, and I've seen actually some still like good voice AI verticalized companies. Actually, very few. Maybe there's like three or four that have voice stacks that are like very good and like very reliable that they built everything in house themselves. I think it's much less popular to do it now because solutions like us are kind of just like right out of the box, like ready to go, and so it just doesn't make sense for the time investment. And I think people are a lot more aware of now of like the future investment that will come if they actually have to scale that thing. Like they have to build a whole infra. And I don't think anyone that's not running real-time audio systems should be running real-time audio if that's not what they're doing. Like, it's not a good use of startup resources, especially when time is so scarce. When it comes to providers like the LiveKit or Pipecat, I think they're also great. I would urge to use their hosted solutions as a startup founder. We're also a hosted solution, but just generally, because I think trying to spin up open source in house and then scale up that open source in house is also just a ton of work. It might be worth it for some who really want to mess with the internals in some way that's just not possible with a out of the box platform like us. I've seen less and less of those cases, but they do happen. They're like, oh, I need the turn taking to work in this like very specific way when there's like background noise or something, and we just can't support that. I think in those cases it does make sense, but I think they're quite rare. So I would urge, in any case, like whatever platform is best for the founder or the verticalized company, to just go with something that's hosted out of the box because infrastructure itself is just not something that people should spend time on.
Totally. Yeah, I think there will be, I'm curious if you have a good analogy of like other types of software in mind, because I think something we're seeing is maybe my stab at it would be there, if you're building a voice agent that's pretty in line with a lot of other voice agents and you're instead focused on how can I build the tooling around this, like an operating system for HVAC companies or a mortgage servicing company, etc. How can you really take that voice agent and operationalize it in the context of these other tools? I think where we advise a lot of our customers to think about like maybe building something in house is when your voice agent is operating in a pretty like different way from other
Yeah.
customers, or you're really like innovating and pushing the edge of what a voice agent can do in the state of the art today. And like that's your core competency and your competitive edge against other companies.
And
Would
I
you say
have
that's
seen
accurate?
this. Yeah, and I have seen this like, again. I just say it's rare, but I have seen it happen once or twice. There's one company coming to mind that I won't name by name because I'm not sure I should. But for them, they've been able to build their stack in house and train their own fine-tuned like text to speech models, and they've just been able to um, because their team had the competence to end up building like a lot of ML stuff in house. It just seemed worth it for them, and it seems like they're winning deals doing it. So yeah, it just depends. It's like speed versus. I don't want to say quality because I'm just like I've seen a lot of people go down the path where they try to achieve higher quality building it themselves and fail. So it's just like if you think you're the top 10% and you're like, hell yes, we're going to do this. This is like core to our business and our edge is owning this infra, then hell yeah. It's just you need to make sure that you know that you're that company.
Yeah, it's definitely
And that it's
hard.
not a yeah. Yeah,
I
because it
think
could be
voice,
invested that founder time could be invested in so many other things that are specific to the customer.
yeah. When it, so in this, I guess like when you're deciding between these different platforms, like what are the things to keep in mind? And I'm sure like you get a lot of questions around like what are kind of like the differentiations between the different platforms, but how should people be thinking about like what to optimize for and what trade-offs to make?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the other folks, so I'll just say, I mean, there are a few players. There's like the Blends, the Retels, the Live Kit, the Pipe Cats. When it comes to comparing open source or not, it's similar to that. It's just like, do you want to build it yourself and touch the internals? And yeah, I think those platforms make sense. There's probably some config that we've built that might not be available in one or the other. So it's just about, taking a look at our docs, taking a look at what's available in terms of params, and just deciding okay, like we can take this trade off or that trade off because we want to have that super custom functionality that we want to build with open source. So it's just about making an educated decision, like feature for feature, just having a like first scope out the use case and then take it from there. And then kind of what you're planning for the future, make sure that is going to be supported. And then when it comes to other platforms, I think I think we're all quite similar, really. But sometimes like you need something that's like easier to use and is much like simpler for like a non-technical user. And so I think there are platforms that are easier for that than with us. We haven't put a ton of time into like drag and drop workflows and that kind of thing. I just don't think that's our strength. We're definitely more for like a technical like developer. But if it's, if this is going to be owned by someone on your ops team and there's no engineering resources available to you, that's maybe a different platform is better for you. We're for like the ultimate power user developer who wants to like build entire products or like super complex solutions for their teams that has like an eng team to work with.
Yeah, I think that's something we've seen is that like you guys, at least from like what we've been seeing with customers, is that Vapi is like more developer, is it kind of somewhere in between, like it has a very developer focused solution where you can have a lot of controllability, but it's definitely not like low code or drag and drop,
Yeah.
but it's also still a bit more like out of the box than say doing a more complex solution.
Yeah, like an open source or something. Yeah, I'd say that's correct.
Yeah, exactly. How are you guys thinking about voice to voice models? And I guess, how do you think that voice to voice models are going
Good
to
question.
change people's strategy? How should people be thinking, preparing for that, etc.?
It's a good question because we launched Sesame on the platform today.
Congrats! Huge
Yeah.
launch.
It's still very beta, I will say. Like, I think what was open source is a lot less than what they're making available in their the companion app, but it's still really cool. We actually, I think, when we started the company, we actually thought that we were going to train like speech to speech models, and that was what we were going to do. Like that was our startup. But we were kind of trying to raise funding with the cascaded model system, and then eventually just train models. We started hiring out like an ML team and stuff. Lo and behold, 4.0 audio demo came out, and we were like, oh, this is not our path. Let's just do everything else. And so we've just been waiting for the moment when the speech to speech models are at the point where one, they're reliable enough, and then they also expose enough configuration to actually be used. Because for example, on our platform, like we have real time, we now have Sesame, which is actually text to speech, but whatever. We will continue to have like speech to speech models in the platform. And when you switch to real time, for example, in our platform, we have to restrict like a lot of functionality because it doesn't support all of the configs we have out of the box for the other providers. And so that's why like sub 0.1% goes through like real time API right now, even though it's been out for a while. I would expect maybe by end of this year, I'd imagine like 20% adoption of the real-time API, just because multilingual is like way easier and stuff like that. And it does sound a lot more natural, but ultimately we're all just pegged to how fast the OpenAI team can move to exposing more. And I don't have a lot of faith in open source moving faster.
Yeah. So I think from there, when you do launch, or like let's say voice to voice is better, do you think like where do you think Vapi then sits in that like as a platform? Do you like really double down on enterprise, or do you think that there's still this like where do you think the gaps will be with voice to voice models?
Yeah, good question. So the gaps are one like configuration, and it's like all of the tools and widgets and inputs and outputs that are required, even when you're using a speech to speech model, will still be required. And so like for example, I want to listen to a call live. And I want it to like plug into my telephony system that is like SIP based. And I want to read out specifically like this set of regex strings slower than others because old people can pick up the phone sometimes. Like just like all of these little edge cases that are required to get voice live will still be there when speech to speech models come out, and we'll kind of have the shortcuts to get them to production faster. On top of that, I think there's a lot to like multi-agent workflows and getting them to work reliably, because within a low late you can't have a large model triple check work a lot of the time, and so you need to use smaller models with smaller prompts. And I think there's a lot of work that can be done there. And then finally, like if there's any entity that stands between the raw speech to speech models and an end use case, whether that's on the phone or in a website or whatever, this entity that's in the middle, from an infrastructure perspective, needs to be able to scale to millions of calls if audio is flowing through it, regardless. So there, people can build that in-house if they want to be that direct connection between the two, but end of the day, probably should leave it to the experts who are good at scaling these things and can sign SLAs for you. And we are on point if shit breaks, and I think teams prefer that rather than themselves.
Yeah, and I think streaming audio or streaming multimedia like this is also no joke. So I think
Mhm.
there's definitely an interesting piece there. I think also just at least personally, I think that there's going to be before we get to true voice to voice, that there's going to be really interesting and maybe for always that there will be interesting architectures around how do you leverage voice to voice to get that full context and full signal, while also having other agents that are doing other things within that conversation. So maybe
Yeah,
it's,
yeah, sure.
I think it'll be really interesting to see what architectures come out of this, but I think there's not necessarily going to be this like switch where all of a sudden everything becomes voice to voice, but instead it becomes yet another tool to add into your voice infrastructure stack.
Yeah, I would say so. And I think what we already see today is people want to switch between like models as well. Like the best one changes maybe like every 2 months or so. And so we don't
Yeah,
just think about like the agent itself. It's like the agent once it's deployed, like observing it, making changes once it's in production, making sure that alerting is going out to everywhere it needs to go out when things go wrong. All of that stuff is important on top of the actual config. As the models change, whatever, all this other stuff stays the same. And we just want to create an experience where a developer can go in and just like switch a model and everything works exactly the way it's supposed to.
totally. I think that's like the really exciting aspect is that everything is moving so fast in voice AI right now that even the differences between different platforms, the differences between different models is changing. Like you guys just did a crazy big launch week last week with
But yeah, that was great.
5 new launches every day. Congrats. So I think that like keeping, I think where the differences are between each platform is very much on a, like a moment to moment basis versus this like locking in a certain direction or strategy, I think.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's why, it's great sign a contract with a flexible provider and it's like, okay, well, I can just like switch on the fly to like whatever is best. I don't have to like lock into anything. And so that's why our approach has always been like very modular and that's just because developers wanted that from the start with how fast things were moving back then and now that even faster now.
Totally. I think, yeah, taking a very modular approach and being able to like constantly like evaluate or like look at other types of like setups definitely makes a lot of sense. One last question actually that I didn't ask. How are you guys thinking about, or how did you guys make such big gains in latency and like how are you able to do that?
When it comes to latency, it was kind of like many, many small innovations over the course of like a year and a half. There are obviously like bigger wins early on, like picking the right models at the right moments and that kind of thing, or moving things on-prem when they had to be moved on-prem, streaming things end to end, like down to the byte level. Like I wouldn't say it's like Rust level optimal, but it's like still extremely optimal, like to the peak of what Node is capable of in terms of like speed end to end. And then we also invested in like make sure we have like good turn taking models and background noise cancellation and stuff so that we can like jump in at the right moment. And those things put together eventually added up to super low latency. But it was super tricky to even just like benchmark end to end and find where the gaps in latency were. Like the phone lines themselves add 400 to 600 milliseconds of latency and you can't even like figure out how much is the phone lines versus not. It's like is something wrong? I don't know. So it took a
Yeah.
long time, but we've now heavily instrumented like throughout the entire pipeline.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of our customers care. I mean, latency is just such a big topic in voice, I think, because that even a half a second more just can completely make the entire conversation feel super unrealistic. And I think generally I think the quality comes a lot from latency. What are other things that you're seeing people optimize for?
There's three variables: performance, latency, and cost. And so it's like this three-dimensional kind of space, and you just have to choose like where you go. And then over time, like they call it in economics, like the efficiency curve or whatever, like it
Yeah.
squeezes closer as new models come out. But right now, I think best on the platform is Deepgram 4.0 Mini, I think is most popular, and 11 Labs. They do have a Flash model now, but I think the performance is just not there. So a lot of people are still on like Turbo or Turbo 2.5. That seems to be like the optimal trade-off combo right now.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for chatting through all these things. It was super fun.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, let me know if you ever want me to hop on again.
Amazing.